Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to The Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we will try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections. In the analysis part, we'll first have a discussion with respect to the evolving relations between India and China, especially in the context of the recent visit by the National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, to China. Then in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the concept of gig economy, the issues confronting it, and the way forward. Then in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles with a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2025 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Now coming to the very first article of the day, this is Decoding the India-China Relations. So recently what we saw was that the National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, he visited China for the special representative talks. And these talks, they resumed after a gap of 4 years. Now, the very objective which was sought through these talks were 3 things. The first was to de-escalate the conflict at the LAC. The second was to strengthen the communication between both the sides. And the third was to enhance military-to-military interactions, right? So these were the 3 objectives. Now, see, again, whenever we talk about international relations, we have primarily 2 kinds of approaches. The first is the approach of idealism, and the second is the approach of realpolitik. Now, this particular column, it's a very beautiful article written by Mr. Sudhindra Kulkarni. He's a very prominent international affairs expert. Now, what he says is that he advocates for a kind of idealism which is to be followed between the relations of India and China, right? So this is what the article is. Now, through this particular analysis, what we'll today look into is the historical evolution of the relation between India and China. What are the issues persisting between India and China? Why is China really important for India? And what should be the way forward for India? And in fact, including China also. So this is the overall gist. Now, this is a part of GS2 international relations. Now, if we talk about the India-China relations, what you must remember is that it is many experts, international affairs experts, they have characterized this particular relationship in the forms of 3 C's. Now, what it stands for? The first C stands for the cooperation. There have been phases where India and China have cooperated. The second C stands for conflict, that there have been phases where you have seen a lot of conflict taking place. Then the third is the part of competition. That is, in many areas, you see that both the countries are competing with each other, right? So this is the broad structure, that is the 3 C's structure. Now, what you need to understand is, considering the present structure of the geopolitics, the relation has evolved, right? And primarily it is the context of the geopolitical complexities. Now, when we are talking about geopolitical complexities, it primarily implies 2 things. The very first is that there is a very tough competition to emerge as a regional leader in Asia, right? Second is, when we talk about the Indian Ocean region, right? So again, Chinese aggressions have been increasing in the Indian Ocean region, right? And the larger construct is the Indo-Pacific construct, right? So that is the kind of statuses. Now, if you look at the evolution of the relations, we can first talk about the ancient era. So in this particular time, we saw that there were a lot of cultural and religious interactions taking place. We had the travelers like the 5th century traveler Fahim, or the 7th century traveler Xuanzang, right, who basically traveled to India. And then we also had some travelers, for example, Bodhidharma, who traveled to China, right? So that led to the formation of the cultural interactions, and it led to the inception of Buddhism in China. Then also we had this Silk Route, which basically facilitated the exchange of goods, exchange of precious metals, exchange of spices, right? Then if we talk about the medieval period, now this period basically saw a kind of limited interaction. Reason? That this period in India in Indian subcontinent saw the rise of Islam. And therefore, it also saw the rise in the number of new trade routes, right? So therefore, the interactions between India and China comparatively reduced. Now, but even in this particular time frame, what we see is that there were maritime trade between India and Southeast Asia. Again, through the Southeast Asia, we saw the interactions between India and China. Next, if we talk about the colonial era, that is from 18th century and 20th century, what we saw was a shared experience of Western exploitation, right? You must remember that we had the Opium Wars, where you saw the participation of the British-controlled Indian territories also, right? So in some way or the other, we both suffered at the hands of the British exploitation. And this Also, this phase also saw that we had prominent leaders like Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore, who basically supported China's resistance against the aggressions committed by the Japanese in the Second World War, right? Then we also saw that this phase led to a kind of shared anti-imperialist sentiment being developed by China and India. Next, if we talk about the post-independence cooperation period from 1947 till 1959. Now, you must know that India was among the very first countries who recognized the People's Republic of China in 1950. Right? And also, we had a lot of interactions during those days. And it ultimately led to the kind of Panchsheel principles. So at that time we used to say Hindi Chini bhai bhai. Now, the Panchsheel principles of 1954, they basically focus upon the principles of peaceful coexistence, how these two countries can coexist peacefully. Then there were some differences which arose. Now, these differences were primarily because India granted the asylum to 14th Dalai Lama because of China occupied Tibet region, right? And then that culminated into a kind of antagonism between India and China. Then if we talk about the conflict and estrangement, that is from 1962 till 1988. Now, this period saw that there were some conflicts at the border, and also because of the Chinese occupation of Tibet, and then India granting the asylum to Dalai Lama, 14th Dalai Lama, it led to a kind of a major conflict, and that was the Sino-Indian War of 1962, which unfortunately witnessed the defeat of India. Then we also saw different border standoffs, border skirmishes, for example, in Sikkim in 1967, or for example, in Sumdorong-Chu Valley in 1987. So these events, they kept on happening. Again, what you need to understand is that this phase was characterized by diplomatic freeze. Now, what do we mean by that? What we are trying to convey is that this phase saw a kind of stagnation in the relations. There was, in informality, there was no interaction. There was no interaction between India and China, right? Then there was the phase of normalization and strategic rivalry, right? See, if we talk about the phase of normalization, what you need to understand is that it was in 1988 when former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, he visited China, and that led to some extent, a kind of normalization. Then a very important milestone in India-China relations is the 1993 Peace and Tranquility Agreement, which basically sought to maintain peace and stability in the region, especially when we talk about the border areas. Then, if we look at the recent years, especially after 2008. So why we have taken the year 2008? Because in 2008, China emerged India's largest trading partner, right? That is the reason we have taken the data as 2008. And this period also saw that the strategic competition was on the rise between India and China, right? But again, we saw different border disputes. For example, recently in 2017, we had the Doklam crisis. More recently, we had in 2020, we had the crisis in Galman Valley, right? Again, what you need to understand is that this phase has been characterized by skewed trade relations. What do we mean by that? What we are trying to emphasize is that China has become India's largest trading partner, but the trade is very much skewed in favor of China, right? And India suffers disadvantages in this particular scenario. Then you also must remember that there is a kind of geopolitical rivalry, primarily because of India's association, India's inclination to the Western democracies, right? And that is a reason that it leads to a kind of confrontation between India and China. So this is the kind of evolution of the relations. Now let's talk about the issues and challenges which persist between India and China. See, at the very root lie this particular issue of border disputes and territorial claims. Here we have this concept of LAC, line of actual control. Now what is this LAC? See, it is the de facto border. We have certain Chinese occupied territories and we have Indian occupied territories. So the border which basically demarcates these territories, that forms the LAC. Now again, this is the bone of contention. There are many areas which China claims to be a part of its own territories. On the other hand, we as India says that these were originally part of the Indian territories and still they are the part of the Indian territories. So if you look at the LAC, it primarily comprises of three parts. The very first is the western sector, which comprises of the Union territories of Ladakh and J&K, right? In this part, we have this particular territory, Aksai Chin, which is occupied by China, illegally by China. Then we have got the central sector, which comprises of the states of the Uttarakhand and Himachal. So we have certain areas which China claims as a part of its own territory. Then we have the eastern sector, which primarily comprises of the states of Sikkim and Arunachal. So China says that this particular area, it is a part of its territory, but obviously it's not true. So this is what the LSE is. And this contention at the LSE has led to frequent standoffs, be it the Galwan Valley clashes or be it the Doklam clashes. So these are some of the areas. Again, what you need to understand is that we have the Aksai Chin area, right? Almost 38,000 square kilometers, which is illegally occupied by China. Then we also have this particular area, which is obviously is under the overall sovereignty of India, but China claims that it is a part of its own territory, right? Then we also see that there is the construction of dual-use villages by China. So at the border areas, we have seen through the satellite imaginaries that China has constructed some of the villages which are strategically very important for China, right? It has invested a lot of military infrastructure, so that those what different strategists call as dual-use villages. Then we have the economic imbalance and the trade deficit. What you need to understand is, as of now, the trade volume has almost crossed $135 billion, right? Now, this particular trade volume, it is highly skewed in favor of China, and India suffers a lot of deficit, right? Almost to the tune of $85 billion. Then we have the exponential rise in the exports from China. See, after the COVID-19 crisis, what we initially thought was that the dependency of the world on Chinese imports would reduce, because we thought of going for economic decoupling. We thought of going for diversifying the supply chain, but that didn't happen. And again, what we have seen is that the Chinese, still, almost all the countries of the world, they're heavily dependent on Chinese imports. And especially when we talk about India, in the last 5 years, the imports from China have exponentially increased. Then it is an issue of consistent backdoor entry into India. Now, what does this mean? See, understand that we have a kind of very good relations with the ASEAN countries, right? For example, let's say Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. But also China has the RCEP, right? It is leading the RCEP, which also includes the Southeast Asian countries. Now, what China is actually doing is that China is supplying some of its commodities to these Southeast Asian countries, and those commodities are then coming into India. Now, they are violating the rules of origin. They're violating the rules of origin. And that is the kind of backdoor entry which Chinese goods are having into the Indian market. Obviously, it's not right. Then there are issues with respect to the water resources. Again, what you need to understand is that China has control over the upstream rivers. We have Brahmaputra, which we call in Chinese as Yarlung Sangpo, right? So again, if a country has the control over the upstream areas of a river, obviously it has a strategic advantage, right? Next is that it has constructed a number of dams, right? A number of big, very large infrastructure projects, hydroelectric infrastructure projects, which obviously is a concern for the states, especially in the northeastern part of the country, right? Then we also have that China is planning to construct a particular hydroelectric project, which would be the largest in the world, that is Midog, right? So obviously it is of concern for India. Then again, what you need to understand is that there is no official water sharing treaty between the two countries. And it was because of this reason that in 2017, after the Doklam crisis, China didn't share the hydrological data. Now, again, understand, the sharing of the hydrological data with respect to the rivers becomes really important because of, the monsoon season, because of the sudden outburst of water. It can lead to the flooding in the downstream areas, that is in the Indian region. So there has to be a constant sharing of the hydrological data, but that is not being done by China. Then there's the issue of cyber threats. Now, what you need to understand is, especially after the COVID, we have seen a sort of a burst of cyber attacks in India. And for example, we had the discoms in Maharashtra, right? Power discoms in Maharashtra, power distribution companies, which suffered a complete blackout. And the reason was attributed to the Chinese aggressions, Chinese cyber attacks. Also recently, we had this case of the AIIMS, where in the AIIMS Delhi, a particular cyber framework was compromised, and the allegations went on the Chinese miscreants. So again, what you need to understand is that there have been frequent cyber attacks in India, that too on the critical sector, critical infrastructure. Then we have also, because of this, the government has basically sought to ban the Chinese apps, but this is not helping. This is not helping because, when we talk about the Chinese dominance in the software and the hardware, it's way too high, right? So therefore, that is not leading to the kind of objective we had. Then if we talk about the regional influence competition, see, Again, what you need to understand is that China has invested billions of dollars through its project, the Belt and Road Initiative. And if we talk about a specific subcomponent of the BRI, that is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, China has almost invested more than $62 billion in Pakistan through this project. Now, obviously, China is doing it for a reason, in order to have a strategic advantage in Pakistan, right? So it is basically luring the Pakistani authorities with a lot of money, and Pakistanis, as you already know, that how intelligent they are accepting all those money, and that is a kind of a strategic challenge for India. For example, let's take the case of the Gwadar port, right? Again, China has invested in a lot of the countries around India. Take the case of Bangladesh, it invested in the Chittagong port. Take the case of Pakistan, as we just talked about, the Gwadar port. Take the case of Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port. Now, this is what we call as the string of pearls approach, right? Which is, it is trying to encircle India from all the sides. Or also the Port Sudan, or also the Djibouti port, right? Again, these ports are having a dual purpose, right? Military cooperation with Pakistan, it has been continuously increasing, and not just from now. It has been, it has been in the picture since many years. Be it the transfer of nuclear technology that was also done by China to Pakistan. So this is of strategic concern for India. Next is diplomatic and international forums. China has not allowed India to become a part of the nuclear supplies group or be a part of the United Nations Security Council. So this is a cause of concern for India. Then it has, see again, what we need to understand is that when we talk about the diplomatic capital, the diplomatic reach of China, it is way too high compared to India. That is the reason that it has made deep inroads in countries of Africa. It has made deep inroads in countries of Latin America, primarily to secure critical minerals, right? Or other strategic minerals. So this is what India is not being able, India is not able to do this, primarily because of the lack of resources. And again, this is obviously a challenge for India. Now, why is China important for India? You need to understand that. The very first is the raw material dependency. See, when we talk about the trading relations, we already know that China is the largest trading partner of India. And the trade volume has already crossed $130 billion. Now, again, what is important is that in these trades, we have the dependency on Chinese imports on critical minerals, on critical industrial supplies. For example, let's take the case of bismuth or silicon, right? Or bismuth and lithium, silicon, titanium. So when we talk about bismuth and lithium, India is dependent on China for more than 80% of these supplies. When we talk about titanium and when we talk about silicon, India is dependent on China for more than 50% of its supplies. Now, these critical minerals are very important when we talk about the electronics manufacturing, right? So obviously, that is a dependency. So also, we have the critical dependency on China when we talk about the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Now, what are these APIs? See, these APIs form the base of pharmaceuticals industry, and India is dependent on China for a lot of these APIs. Then electronic components, as I just talked about. Then what you need to understand is that India is basically dependent on the imports of the solar modules, the cells, for almost 80% of its needs. And out of these total imports, almost 60% of the imports are basically done from China, right? So that is a cause of concern. Next is technology and digital infrastructure. Despite these bans, which we basically imposed after COVID-19, things have not changed, right? Still what we see is that there is a Chinese dominance. There's a Chinese dominance when we talk about the electronics. For example, let's talk about the telecommunication infrastructure. We have companies like Huawei, we have companies like ZTE, right? Which have, again, please understand that even if you have the smartphone manufacturers of the Korea or let's say Japanese or American, still these smartphones, they have a huge component which is sourced from China, right? So China has still a dominance. So more than 75% of the smartphones used in India, they are basically from the Chinese manufacturers. Then critical telecommunications and battery technology. As I just told you, that when we talk about the critical telecommunications, be it in the usage of the defense, be it in the space, be it the telecommunications which are needed for the strategic purpose, China's equipments have a dominance there. So obviously it's a cause of concern. Also, India is working a lot upon the electric vehicles, right? And in this particular electric vehicle domain, we have the Chinese products, the Chinese batteries. For example, you must have heard about the company BYD, right? So this is one of the largest electric vehicles companies in the world. Then is investment and expertise. See, for years, China has invested a lot in the infrastructure. So they have gained a lot of expertise in this particular area. So India obviously need that kind of expertise. Then if we talk about the Indian startups, so according to our data, till 2020, China almost invested 3.2 billion US dollars in 18 of the prominent startups in the country. So Chinese investments have been there in Indian startups, also including the unicorns. Now, next is the trade route dependency. See, again, what you need to understand is that we have almost all the countries of the Southeast Asia, which are the members of the RCEP, right? And RCEP is a sort of a trade group which is dominated by China. So obviously, it is a cause of concern for India. What you need to understand is that the trade route which India uses, right, for example, that of the South China Sea and the strategic Malacca Strait, it comprises almost 50% of the trade volumes of India, right? So obviously, it is a concern. Now, what should be the way forward for India? See, the very first thing is that we need to adequately focus upon the economic diversification and self-reliance. What the government of India has been doing, and it said it as the Atmanirbhar Bharat, right? So again, we need to focus upon the domestic manufacturing capabilities, and we should do it by expanding the schemes like the production-linked incentive schemes for different commodities, right? Also, we should adequately invest in missions like the semiconductor mission. Also, we can go for strategic partnerships with different countries, for example, be it Japan, be it South Korea, or be it the European Union nations, so that we can have adequate technology transfer with respect to these technologies, right? Next is, we need to adequately focus upon developing and boosting these MSMEs in the country. MSMEs in India form the backbone of the Indian economy. So we need to give them adequate credit. We need to give them adequate interest subvention. We need to give them adequate facilities, right? So that they can develop and then they can help India to compete with Chinese manufacturing. Then we also need to focus upon standards and certification processes. Now, this is very important. We are already having this anti-dumping duties imposed on the Chinese goods, but we need to have proper standards in place so that on the basis of WTO compliant mechanisms, we can basically enforce these mechanisms on the Chinese imports in India on the basis of proper standards and certification processes. Next is strategic military modernization. Now, what we're trying to say is that we need to adequately invest in the infrastructure at the LAC, along the LAC. For example, let's say the advanced lending grounds. For example, let's say the strategic roads, which India has already been doing. So we need to adequately invest in those projects. Next, we need to enhance the surveillance capabilities, be it through satellites, be it through drones, be it through other mechanisms. We need to enhance the surveillance. Then we need to basically invest in the mountain warfare capabilities. See, this particular area which we have, this basically comprises of the very, grim winter situation is there in these particular area. So we need to have a proper mountain warfare capabilities, be it with the Indian Army or be it with the ITBP, right? Next is that we need to basically also focus upon regional leadership enhancement. So through various mechanisms, India has already been doing so. For example, let's say the BIMSTEC, right? Or let's say the Indian Ocean Rim Association. We can basically have more interactions with the countries around India. Or what we can do is for these small countries, for example, let's say Bangladesh or the other countries like Sri Lanka or even Nepal or Bhutan, we need to give them adequate funds so that they do not fall into the laps of Chinese, right? And Nepal has already been doing so. Take the case of Myanmar, right? So they have already fell into the lap of China. Then we can also focus upon the alternate supply chain initiatives. Now, one of the very important initiative is the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. Now, you need to tell me the countries which are a part of the SCRI. So we need to come up with these supply chain initiatives, diversifying the supply chains, right? So that we can achieve this economic decoupling, right? So again, through this particular mechanism, we can reduce the reliance on Chinese imports. Next is diplomatic engagement strategy. What we need to focus upon is a proper dialogue through multiple channels, through multiple forums, be it the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, be it the BRICS, right? Also, we need to focus upon the active participation in multilateral forums. As I told you, for example, be it the United Nations, be it the BIMSTEC with the countries around India, be it the BRICS, right? So that we can have adequate conversation. Then we also need to focus upon the issue-based coalitions. For example, let's talk about the climate change. Now, China and India are one of the largest carbon dioxide emitters, right? Greenhouse gas emitters. So what we can do is we can basically come together, work upon the renewable energy or other technology initiatives so that we can reduce the ill effects of climate change, right? Continue the strategic autonomy. Now, this is very important. So even though the US criticizes this stance of strategic autonomy of India, but through this particular approach, through this particular foreign policy approach, we can basically balance the relations which we have with China, with the US, or with the Russia, right? So this is the kind of way forward for India. Now, in this particular editorial, as I told you in the beginning, the writer has gone for an approach of idealism. He's not really willing to go for a real politic or a sort of a muscular approach. So what he says is that there are some steps which should be taken by China on one side and India on the other. For example, what he says for China is that China needs to assure the security of India. It needs to make it very clear that it does not pose any kind of threat to India. Next is, what it also has to focus upon is that it has to very categorically, very clearly say that yes, Pakistan is sponsoring the terrorism. Then it should support India's rise. Obviously, this is not very much possible. But according to the writer, China should support India's rights when we talk about its permanent membership in the UNSC, or be it its membership when we talk about an NSG, Nuclear Supplies Group. Then it should respect equality. That is, it should not consider India as a subordinate partner. It should basically consider India as an equal partner in the overall multipolar Asia, then also multipolar world. Then, what are the steps which should be taken by India? The very first is avoid power asymmetry narratives. India should not over-rely on the kind of alliances we have like Quad, on the kind of organizations we have. It should basically maintain a kind of a stance where the core issues are given important, right? Then it should maintain the one China policy. India should refrain from basically supporting the Taiwanese claim or basically supporting the Tibet's claim, right? It should maintain the one China policy. Next, it should reduce the anti-China sentiments. See, the kind of sentiments we have in the media, which have percolated in the minds of people, according to the writer, what he says is very negative with respect to China. Knowing that we are one of the greatest dependency on the Chinese imports. So again, what the author is trying to say is that we need to focus upon making sure that this kind of anti-China sentiment needs to be reduced. Then what can be the trust building actions, low-hanging fruits? The very first is restart the direct flights. So after the COVID, the government of India basically cancelled the direct flights. What the author is trying to say is that we need to resume the direct flights. Next is increase visas. Now this is a very interesting point. According to the column, it says that in the last year, China gave visas to Indian citizens to almost 2 lakh Indians, right? But India has only given the visas to almost only 10,000 Chinese, right? So this is what the author is saying, that we need to increase the visas. Then there has to be journalist exchange so that we can share the views and we can promote the cooperation. Then we should lift the bans on different applications, for example, WeChat, right? So it has to be reduced. Then we need to focus upon boosting the trade and investment. We can seek the Chinese expertise in the infrastructure development. For example, let's say the high-speed rail, or for example, the development of the overall infrastructure, Chinese project management skills. Also, we need to make sure that the Indian imports increase into the China. Then greater FDI is needed because China has a lot of funds with it. So again, with a proper regulated framework, we can have a structure where adequate amount of FDI is allowed to India, and then that would obviously boost the overall infrastructure in the country. See, again, what we're trying to say is that there are a lot of issues which still exist between India and China. For example, be it the territorial dispute, be it the economic, the trade dispute, right? Or be it the other dispute. But again, this particular special representative talk has given a sort of a bright spot. And we need to incorporate all these measures. Again, it has to be a mix of the real politic and the idealism. It cannot be like a single approach of idealism or real politic. So we need to basically manage our own interests. Obviously, India has a very important foreign policy structure, and that is the strategic autonomy. So we need to follow that. We need to incorporate these steps so that we can basically, it can lead to a situation where these two giants, be it the dragon and the elephant, we can live peacefully and we can obviously implement and follow the principles of Panchsheel. So this is what you need to know with respect to this article. Let's talk about a mains practice question. The question says, India-China relationship is characterized by a mix of cooperation and competition, influenced by historical border disputes, economic interdependence, and regional geopolitics. Critically analyze. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer in this question. Coming to the next article, this is with respect to the Supreme Court on gig economy. So Supreme Court, through a particular judgment, has said to the government that it should not emulate the kind of precarious employment situations we have in the gig economy in its own employment. Now, this gives us the opportunity to discuss about this concept of gig economy. What are the issues with respect to gig economy and what can be the way forward? Now, this is a part of GS3 Indian economy. Now, Let's first talk about what do we mean by gig economy. See, it is a kind of a labor market scenario where the jobs, they're characterized by short-term, freelance or contract-based work arrangements. That is what you need to understand is that the jobs which are given, they are on the basis of need, on the need basis. They are not of permanent nature, right? Again, since we have the dominance of the e-commerce platforms, they have literally come up in different domains, be it the ride-hailing services like Uber, be it the food delivery platforms, right? So again, it is often facilitated through the online platforms. Now, what it represents, it like as a shift to a more flexible, task-based and on-demand workforce. Again, what we're trying to emphasize is that the nature of the job is not on a permanent basis. It is on a need basis, right? So obviously, if the nature of the job is not on a permanent basis, it would have the consequences in terms of the social security benefits. So in the gig economy, in most of the cases, what we see is that the persons who are a part of the gig economy, they are not entitled to the social security benefit. Their situation, their employment conditions are very precarious, right? And often what they're termed as independent contractors, or you must have heard, we use the word delivery partners, right? Again, they're not termed as employees. As we say, they're termed as independent contractors, freelancers, or part-time workers, right? Now, if you look at the data, you can see now this data is sourced from the Niti Aayog, right? And this data is based on the data which was collected between October 22 and January 23. What this particular data says is that almost 77 lakh Indians are currently engaged in the gig work. And it also estimates that by 2029 and 30, India is projected to have almost 2.35 crore gig workers. The source is Niti Aayog. So almost we have, different types of these platforms. For example, Uber, be it Swiggy, be it Zomato, be it the other platforms like Dunzo, right? All primarily of all these platforms, they are actually dependent on these gig workers. So if we go about knowing the sector-wise analysis, so we can see that almost 27 lakh gig workers are engaged in the retail, trade and services. Then we have almost 13 million Indian gig workers in the transportation sector. Then we have almost 6 lakh Indian gig workers in the manufacturing sector, 6 lakh Indian gig workers in finance and insurance services, and then almost 25 lakh Indian gig workers in the e-commerce websites. So this is the overall sector-wise analysis. Now, again, as I said, that we have key sectors. For example, in transport and logistics, we have the ride-hailing services, for example, Uber, Ola. Then we have got the food delivery platforms, for example, Swiggy, Zomato. Then we've got personal services, for example, Urban Company. Then we've got freelancers. Now, again, what you need to understand is that when we talk about these gig workers, it is not just these people, the low-skilled people who are basically, having very low wages, or who are not having the social security benefits. We are also talking about those highly skilled people who are doing the project on a freelance basis, right? So it also includes those platforms which are hiring highly skilled people for a particular project, right? So it also includes those. So we have, for example, the designers, writers, software developers, right? So we have platforms like Upwork. Then we have got the healthcare and education. For example, we have got the online tutors, right? Now, if you look at the demography, what is the age structure of people who are primarily working in this particular gig economy? What you will see is that most gig workers are in the age bracket of 18 to 35 years. So you have this data from the Business Today. It says that almost we have the 32% of the people from 19 to 25 years. Then we have almost 20% of the people from 41 to 60 years, and almost 48% of the people from 26 to 40 years. So see, if you combine this and this, you have a large section which is primarily the young population, right? What is the kind of skills which these people have? So see, primarily the kind of skills which majority of the people have, they are medium skilled or low skilled, right? So if you look at this particular chart, infographic, you'll see that almost 47% of the people, they are medium skilled, right? And then we have got low skilled, which amount to almost 31%. Now, if you combine these two data, you'll see that almost 78 to 80% are the people in the gig economy which have low to medium skills. There are very less people, almost 20%, who are high skilled, right? So they work as independent consultants or as let's say administrative assistants or others. So this is the kind of the skill-based categorization is all about. Then if we talk about the income, now there are some people in the gig economy which are earning a lot of money. So there are some high-skilled workers earning substantial amount of money. But most gig workers, they are actually earning very less. For example, in the delivery services, right? So that is a point of concern. Now, what is the factor? What are the factors which have driven the rise of gig economy in India? The very first is increased smartphone and internet penetration. So what we have seen, especially in the last 1 decade, is that internet penetration has increased, also including in the rural areas. Now, this primarily implies two things. The first is that these platforms, online platforms, are able to integrate more with the workers, right? They can basically connect with the workers. Also, they can also connect well with the consumers also, right? So it is basically increasing the reach of these platforms. Next is changing work preferences. Now, again, when we talk about the Gen Z generation, when we talk about the millennials, they want a kind of a work sort of pattern where they can give adequate importance to the work-life balance, right? So they want a kind of more flexibility with respect to the work they are doing, so that they can decide on their own the kind of timelines within which they are going to complete a particular project, right? So it gives priority to the flexibility and balance. Then the rise of e-commerce and startup culture. So what you need to understand is that a lot of startups have come. India is already one of the largest destinations when we talk about the incubation centers, when we talk about the startup ecosystem. So obviously, most of these startups, they are based on the gig economy, on the gig workers, right? So that is the reason that we see a rise of gig workers. Then we talk about the consumer demand for convenience and quick service. Again, when we are talking about the rise in the disposable income, the rise in consumerism. So that has also an implication on this particular aspect. So we are not really inclined to go out and fetch the material on our own. What we are saying is we are dependent on the 10 minutes delivery. We are dependent on the food deliveries, right? So that is a kind of reason where these gig workers, the number of gig workers has increased. Then is abundance of low cost labor. See, again, in a country like India, what we have is there is a deficit of proper employment opportunities, right? Good employment opportunities. And therefore, we have these low-skilled people, majority of the low-skilled people who are ready to work at whatever kind of wages are being provided by these online platforms. So this is a kind of reason that we have a sudden growth in the number of gig workers in the country. Now, let's talk about the major challenges faced by the gig workers in India. So the very first is lack of basic rights and social security. As I told you in the beginning, that we have these gig workers who are not basically seen as proper employees. So they are devoid of all those social security benefits, which normally permanent employees have, be it the maternity benefit, be it the insurance services, right? Be it the pension benefits. So they're not entitled in many of the cases. Next is precarious employment and income insecurity. See, the kind of work they're doing, it is based on the need basis of the company. So as you will have the rise in the demand with respect to a particular commodity, with respect to a particular online platform, you will see the rise in the number of jobs which are being offered by those platforms. But if you will see that there is a sudden drop in the basically demand of that particular commodity, obviously it would lead to a sort of laying off of those people. So they do not have any kind of job security also. Then algorithmic management. Now this is very important. See, most of these online platforms, the work allocation which is done to these partners, these delivery partners, is on the basis of a particular algorithm. That is a computer software. Now there is literally very less human intervention. Now, what it means is that on the basis of that particular algorithm, it says that a particular person has to do these many number of tasks, and only then he'll be entitled to the income, right? So in some cases, what we see is that because of these algorithmic management, it leads to the persons are overworked, right? It leads to the exploitation and the unfair treatment of the people. Now, this is a very important concern. Next is there are health and safety risks. So you must have seen that during the heat waves, during the sudden rainfall, right? When there is heavy rainfall, these delivery partner travels, right? So again, because of that, it sometimes leads to the health issues, which overall affects the overall well-being of the people involved. Then there is a lack of collective bargaining power. So what we usually see in permanent employments is that people are united, they have unions, right? So they have bargaining power, but that is not really possible in case of the gig workers, right? So they have literally no bargaining power. Then we have got digital divide and skill gaps. Now, what we are trying to emphasize is, though these online platforms, they're based on proper, applications and internet, and these delivery partners, they're using the same, but again, they still do not have proper knowledge with respect to the kind of functioning of these digital devices, right? And this basically inhibits their social mobility, right? Because they don't have adequate skills with respect to these digital devices. So this is a point of concern, and always that skill gap exists And it is because of that they're unable to go to higher levels of jobs, right? Good and quality employment opportunities, right? Now, what have been the government initiatives and scheme? So we have the Code on Social Security of 2020. Now, this is trying to basically extend the social security benefits to the unorganized workers, which obviously include the gig workers also. So we have this concept of social security fund, where the government would also contribute, that these partners, these gig workers would also contribute, the online platforms would also contribute, and then that fund would be used for the overall well-being of the gig workers. Then we have got the e-Shram portal. Now, this is a very important portal because it is trying to register the unorganized workers. Now, after these workers have registered, which obviously includes the gig workers, they can get access to different social security benefits. So they are being provided with a universal identification number, right? Then as of February 2023, over 280 million, almost 28 crores unorganized workers have joined this particular platform. Then we have got Skill India and Digital India initiatives. Through these platforms, we are trying to enhance the overall skills with respect to the digital domain and make sure that there is adequate social mobility of these people, right? Upskilling and digital literacy programs so that they can access better employment opportunities. Then we have got different initiatives by the state governments. For example, let's take the case of Karnataka. So Karnataka has come up with State Gig Workers Welfare Board. Now, through this particular board, let's say you have a particular gig worker who has basically, suffered an accident. So he can be provided with adequate funds and help through this particular fund. Then we have got other labor welfare schemes, for example, Pradhan Mantri Shram Yogi Mandhan Yojana, which aims at providing the pensions to the people of these unorganized sector after they reach the age of 60 years. Now, what should be the way forward? See, the very first is that we need to give them a legal recognition. There has to be a clarity that whether they are employees or not, whether they are entitled to the social security benefits which normally the employees they basically have, right? So this is a kind of clarity which needs to be there. Next is that we need to improve the social security coverage. What we need to understand is that this code on social security, it needs to be implemented very soon. It has not been still implemented. So it needs faster implementation. Then there has to be this provision of minimum wage and work hour regulation. Very important. So as to make sure that these people are not exploited because of these algorithms of these online platforms, we need to have a proper minimum wage and work hour regulation. Then we should focus upon digital and financial literacy programs so that these people can be upskilled. And therefore, once they would be upskilled, they would have the social mobility, and they would then, because they would basically have good employment opportunities, and then obviously social mobility. Then there is platform accountability. That is, we need to make sure that there is proper algorithm transparency, right? We need to make sure that there is proper fair compensation. There is proper grievance redressal mechanism, be it Zomato, be it Swiggy. What we need to make sure is that if a worker has a grievance, there has to be a proper method through which the grievance can be resolved. Then there is a need to constitute these welfare boards, the worker cooperatives, so that they can have adequate funds, and then those funds can be used in case of emergency. Let's say a person has suffered an accident, or in some unfortunate situation, if the person has succumbed to the injuries, so the family can be provided with adequate funds, right? Then there has to be focus upon the health and safety standards. So again, if these delivery partners are traveling in extreme heat waves condition, in extreme rain situation, so there it has to be made sure that there is proper insurance given to these people. There is proper sort of health management system which is there for these people. So again, what we are trying to say is that definitely gig economy is something which offers a lot of potential to the overall economy of the country. But again, there are serious issues with it. And we need to have a proper framework, because as Niti has already said, that we would witness almost 2.35 crore people joining the gig economy by 2029-30. So this is a huge number. So we need to have a proper framework of where you provide adequate social security benefits to these people, so that India can capitalize on this particular gig economy. Again, the gig economy should not be just beneficial for these online platforms. It should also be beneficial for these gig workers. This is what you need to know with respect to this particular article. Let's have a mains practice question. The question says, gig economy in India offers great potential to transform the overall labor market and enhance the economic returns. However, it faces some serious challenges which need adequate policy response. Discuss, 15 marks, 250 words. We also have a PYQ, and it says, examine the role of gig economy in the process of empowerment of women in India. 10 marks question. So if possible, do also write an answer on this particular question. So coming to the simplified section, we have the first article which talks about the remittances received by India in the year 2024. So we have a particular blog which is published by the World Bank, which talks about this particular information along with the infographics and says that India received the highest remittances in the year 2024. Now, remittances are basically the money which the people in the country receive from those people who are basically living outside and who are working outside, and they send the money to the country to support their families. Now, this is one of the amount. This is very crucial for the overall development, overall well-being of those families and the overall development of the country. So this is a very important article. Possibly a question in the prelims can also come. So let's talk about this article. So it says that in 2024, India received an estimated $129 billion worth of remittances, the highest ever for a country in a year. Moreover, India's share in the global remittances was 14.3%. These conclusions are based on the report published by the World Bank, or the blog published by the World Bank. Remittances, as I just told you, refer to the money that individuals working abroad send back to their families in the home countries. Now, these are a crucial source of income for the households. They contribute significantly to the economy of the recipient country. Now, following India, which is the next country, we have Mexico and China received the largest remittances in the year 2024. We have this particular chart 1, which basically talks about the share of the top 10 receivers. So we have India, then we have got Mexico, we have China. Please do remember the sequence of these countries, because possibly a question can be asked in the prelims, right? So remittances, as I said, they refer to the money that individuals working abroad send back to support their families in the home countries. Then the other countries, we have got Philippines, France, Pakistan, others. Next, if we talk about, it says that the chart 2 shows the share of global remittances of top 10 countries. So it says that now it talks about the period from 2000 to 2024. It says that China's share of remittances, they grew from less than 1% in the early 2000s. Just look at this. So in the early 2000, the Chinese share was less than 1%. Look at the blue line, right? Now, to over 10% by the late 2000s. So if we talk about the late 2000s, it basically crossed the 10% mark. From 2020, the share declined rapidly, reaching to 2-decade low of 5.3%. So if we talk about 2020, so we can just see that it basically decreased to 5.3%, right? 5.3%. Next, China's rising prosperity. See, the reasons what the article has attributed to, that why you saw a reduction in the overall remittances being received by China. So there are two reasons. First is China's economic prosperity and aging population slowed the pace of emigration of less skilled people, which basically contributed to this particular decline. So you had less number of low skilled people going outside and sending money, right? So therefore the remittances which China was receiving, that was declining. India's share has remained above the 10% mark. With few exceptions, post-pandemic year, there has been a rapid increase in its share. So if you just look at India's rise from here, so India's share has been continuously over 10%. India's share in the global remittances was twice the share of Mexico in 2024. So it is almost twice of the Mexico. So we have Mexico somewhere here and we have India, which is almost twice that of Mexico. Then in some economies, remittances play a more critical role in funding the current account deficit and fiscal shortfalls, right? So whenever you have a country facing these fiscal shortfalls, it can depend upon this particular money which is being sourced through the remittances. Now, if you look at this particular map, it shows the estimated remittances in 2024 as a share of country's GDP, right? So this is the size of the circle basically represents the overall absolute amount of remittances, right? And if the country is more here, if the circle is more on the right side, it shows the share that it share as a part of the GDP, right? So estimated remittances in 24 as a share of country's GDP. Each circle is a country. So the farther the circle is to the right, the higher the remittances in 24 as a share of GDP. The bigger the circle, in absolute terms, it shows the remittances. In Nepal, the remittances formed over 25% of the GDP in 2024. Just look at this particular chart. So you have Nepal somewhere here, right? So it is having more than 25% of its GDP as remittances. Similarly, you have got other countries. For example, you have Tajikistan, you've got Tonga, we've got Nicaragua, right? Over 25% of their respective GDPs. India's remittances formed 3.3% of the GDP this year. Nepal remittances formed 25%, right? Again, for many low and middle income countries, remittances act as a major source of income. Next aspect is that in the recent years, these remittances have even surpassed the total foreign direct investments in low and middle income countries. Now, what is FDI? FDI basically refers to the investments by a foreign country to control or run a business in the other countries, where they seek a kind of investments for having permanent establishment, permanent manufacturing capacity, for example, right? Remittances are also much higher than the official development assistance ODA received by these countries, right? ODA is the aid from the rich countries to help the poorer ones develop, often through grants and cheap loans. Just look at this particular map. So you see that the FDI has continuously dipped, especially after the COVID crisis. But the remittances, they have continuously increased. It is much higher. It is much higher when we talk about the difference. The remittances are much higher than the FDI. And obviously, they're very more than the official development assistance. Chart 4 compares the remittances. Over the past decade, remittances increased by 57%, while the FDI declined by 41% in the low and middle income countries. You need not to memorize the numbers. Have a fair good idea with respect to the kind of remittances being received by India, one of the largest shares, and then the other countries in the list. Mexico, China, and then let's talk about as a percentage of GDP, right? It was around 3.3% for India, right? And there are many other countries who are really dependent on this particular source for their overall development. And if we talk about the FDI, in comparison to the FDI, it is much higher, right? It is much higher, and also it is higher than the official development assistance. Coming to the next article, this is with respect to the myth of meritocracy in the IT sector of India. See, the gist of the article is that we generally have this perception that the IT sector is based on the competency level of the candidates. The IT sector is very inclusive, right? It provides opportunities to all who have the talent. But again, we had a particular survey which was carried out by the NSSO. And on the basis of the findings of the survey, we had a particular analysis which the authors of this particular column have done. And they have come to the conclusion that still we have a lot of disparities in the IT sector. It's not like that the IT sector doesn't suffer from these disparities, the caste-based disparities. What they say is that we have a lot of disparities, we have a lot of sort of discrimination which exists in the IT sector also, right? The article is important because that can give you a sort of the feed material once you're writing a particular essay, or also if there is a question with respect to the social setup, right? If there's a question on Indian society, if there's a question on the linkage of Indian society with that of these caste-based discrimination or gender-based discrimination, right? So let's go through the article. Good article. So it says India's IT sector is one of the fastest growing industries, contributing to over 7% of the India's GDP, and so much so that we have countries in the sub-Saharan Africa who are basically trying to replicate the India's success in the software exports. Then what the article says is that the performance-driven and the high-paying nature of the jobs in the IT sector make it a preferred career destination for millions of people. The job market in this industry, it has often been said as the epitome, as the top level of skill-based meritocracy and inclusivity, with the social backgrounds of the candidates having no role. But what the analysis has found is, analysis based on the household survey conducted by the National Sample Survey Organization unravels stark caste-based disparities, right? So this is something which is very surprising, right? We also have the caste-based discrimination, which is there, disparities, which is there in the overall IT sector, indicating social inequalities are significantly alive in the job market. So what they have done is they have utilized two rounds of NSSO. So the NSS 78 survey and the NSS 68th round, and which basically are representative at the national level. Now the survey comprised almost 30,000 individuals. Now the study found that the probability of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes to be engaged in the IT sector is only 10% in comparison to the upper caste having 27%, right? So the probability of the upper caste is quite high when we compare to the SCs and the STs. Then surprisingly, this disparity in the employment probabilities has increased over time from 2011 to 2020. In 2011-12, lower caste groups faced only 6% probability of being engaged in the IT sector compared to 17% of the upper caste. Again, you need not to memorize this data, but this particular finding can be used once you are writing a particular answer, that still you also have these disparities in the private sector also. This suggests that the IT sector grows, it fails to address or even acknowledge the social barriers that exclude the marginalized groups. Now, the study also says that even when lower caste groups manage to enter the IT job market, they face labor segmentation, which is reflected in the caste-based disparities in the wage earnings, right? So even if they are entering, they are suffering the kind of disparities in the wage which they are being paid, right? SC and the other backward class workers in the IT sector face negative wage differentials of 24.9 and 22.5% respectively as compared to the upper caste workers. Can you see? Even in the wage, there is a sort of a differential. Findings align with the labor market segmentation theory, what the theory says, which predicts a division of the labor market into dualistic segments. That is, with workers in the lower segment facing structural barriers in the upward mobility. What do we mean by structural barriers? As we just saw in case of the gig workers. So they face hindrances in the social mobility, primarily because they have low amount to invest in their skills, to invest in their overall education so that they can upskill themselves and have good employment opportunities, facing limited returns to private investments in education and skills. Then the article also talks about the gender inequality. It says labor market disparities in the IT also affect the other vulnerable sections. For example, we have women. Female workers in the IT earn 26.2% lower than the males irrespective of their caste. Very important data. If you are writing any answer with respect to the IT sector or the role of women, if there's a question on the role of women or the gender disparity, this data can be used, right? So female workers in the IT earn 26.2% lower than the males irrespective of their caste, though their employment probabilities are closer to that of the men. Labor market segmentation has far-reaching socio-economic implications. By systematically excluding a significant portion of the population, the industry not only sacrifices the economic efficiency but also undermines the social justice. Now, why this becomes important is that we have set a goal in the very preamble itself that we need to strive for a society where we value this concept of social justice. But these things, they imply that still you have a lot of disparities and discriminations which are being exercised. Diversity in the workplace is an important source of comparative advantage. So we also have the report by the International Labour Organization, which says that higher levels of diversity in the workplace is associated with greater productivity and innovations. Important point can be used. The Network for Business Sustainability says that 1% increase in the racial diversity associated with a yearly firm productivity gain between $729 US and $1,590 US per worker. Yet, the Indian IT sector's reluctance to embrace true diversity risks stifling its potential for sustainable growth. So we need to incorporate a kind of more inclusive culture where we are also paying importance to the kind of diversity we have, because ultimately it would have a comparative advantage for the firm. Further, it discourages the marginalized sections from investing in the skill development. Again, the same structural barrier. Several policy steps are needed. What are the policy steps which are basically being given by the authors? They say, first, all companies should be required to publicly disclose their workforce diversity matrix. Very important. Such transparency can encourage accountability and motivate the employers to prioritize diversity. So this particular data should be made in the public domain so that the companies can on its own focus upon having a more diverse workforce. Second, lower caste entrepreneurs should be provided with greater incentives and training for the entrepreneurship. Third, bridging the skill gap among the marginalized sections. It can pave the way for a more equitable and inclusive job market. Again, as we have also seen in the gig workers article, that there has to be adequate focus upon the skill development so that once they have more skills, once they are upskilled, they can go for better employment opportunities. Now, here's a very important body which is talked about, that is the National Sample Survey Office. Now, it's a key organization in India's overall statistics structure, right, responsible for conducting large-scale sample surveys to collect data on various socio-economic aspects. So, operates under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation and plays a very important role in reliable and comprehensive statistics for policy making and research. Key features, let's talk about. So, it was established in the year 1950 to conduct nationwide surveys on socio-economic aspects. Then, functionality, it is tasked with collecting data on employment, unemployment, consumption, poverty, literacy, conducts the agricultural surveys, rural, urban households, publishes periodic reports such as employment, unemployment, consumer expenditure. Then the surveys conducted are consumer expenditure survey, employment, unemployment survey, health and morbidity survey, agricultural statistics. Now, this information is important. In 2019, the NSSO was merged with the Central Statistics Office, CSO, to form the National Statistical Office, NSO. This is very important. This reorganization aimed at streamlining the data collection and processing. Again, what is the significance? Provides evidence-based data. See, for any government, policy making is a very important aspect. Policy making has to be based on proper data sources, right? And that data, so that it can basically, the policies can be aligned according to the needs of the society, according to the aspirations, according to the status of the standards of living. And that data, for that particular data, these bodies become really very important for planning and implementing the government programs. Acts as a basis for academic research and economic policy formulation. So this is what you need to know with respect to this particular article. Some of the points can be really important once you're writing your mains answer. That is it for this article. Coming to the next article, this is with respect to the regenerative farming, the natural farming. See, the overall gist of the article is that since the Green Revolution, initially India was a food deficient country, but then we started with the Green Revolution and we invested a lot in the high yielding variety seeds, the investment in the fertilizers, pesticides, and that led to a substantial increase in the overall food production. And to this day, we are, a food sufficient country. But again, what the authors of the article are trying to say is that as we would witness an increase in the population, and as we would see a sort of a diminishing productivity of the soil, it can lead to a situation where India is not having the enough resources to provide to its citizens, the food security to its citizens. And therefore, what the authors are trying to say is that we should go for regenerative farming. We should reduce the dependence on these chemicals. We should reduce the dependence on these synthetic chemicals, the pesticides, and we should go for a more organic form of agriculture, right? Different policy recommendations have been given in this particular article. Important can be, there can be a question possibly in the mains, which talks about the kind of importance of regenerative agriculture, more natural farming, right? And over there, these points can become very important. So India, with a population of 145 crores, is self-reliant in its food and nutritional requirements. Over the last 70 years, we have achieved this food security by expanding the area under agriculture and intensifying the practices, largely during the Green Revolution, right? With annual increase in the demand of 2 to 3% for food, India must grow 50% more food by 2050. Considering the growth in the population, we must grow 50% more food by 2050. India is likely to fall short of this food demand by 2050. Current regime of intensive agriculture, where we are focusing too much on the chemical fertilizers, we are focusing too much upon these pesticides, led to a decline in the soil health, and this is obviously not an option. A recent State of Food and Agriculture report by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization tells that growing social, health and environmental costs of global agriculture and food systems, it could cost a total $12 trillion annually. With the current ways of producing can only fulfill the calorific requirements of more than 8 billion people worldwide. Yet it yields a massive cost to our society and to the environment. So what they're trying to say is, though we are able to satisfy the hunger, or we are able to provide food to almost 8 billion people, but it is having, as of now, a lot of costs associated with it. The FAO report highlights that the Indian agri-food system has hidden costs, including damages to health, environment and society. The continuous addition of synthetic fertilizers over the past many decades has reduced the soil organic carbon content from a healthy national average of 2.4% in 1947, to a merely 0.4% today. So you just see the organic content, the soil carbon content has reduced drastically from 1947 till now, well below the threshold of 1.5%, which is essential for maintaining the soil's arable properties. Now, this has affected the prospects of the food security, and it costs India a huge sum of 47.7 lakh crore over the last 70 years, which amounts to almost 68,000 crores per year in lost carbon value. Then these costs are in addition to the current 2 lakh crore per year subsidy to the fertilizer industry, which the government is providing. Synthetic fertilizers also cause 25 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions, costing almost 14,800 crore per year. These subsidies support the wasteful use of synthetic fertilizers that directly reduce the soil organic content. Then they generate enormous greenhouse gases, and ultimately it leads to the risking of India's food, nutritional and ecological security. The loss of soil health, the response ratio of fertilizers has declined from 12.1 kg of grain per kg NPK in 1960-69 to 5.1 kg grain per kg of NPKs. Just see that the response ratio is reducing. That is, the soil is not responding to the kind of fertilizers we are applying, right? India could face the food shortages as early as 2035, partly due to an increase in the food demands, growing population, productivity losses due to climate impacts, and loss of soil health, declining the response to synthetic fertilizers. Again, these reasons are important. You can basically mention them in your answers. Obviously, a prelim question can also be formed on the basis of these reasons, right? So obviously, not much of concept is involved here, but the information which is provided can really used, can be a source of a value addition in your answers. India must therefore seek a climate resilient, nature-based alternate agriculture model that reduces the risk of associated with the intensive agriculture. Where in intensive agriculture, we are focusing upon the high usage of these chemicals, fertilizers and pesticides. Improves the productivity and the livelihood of farmers while respecting the planetary boundaries, which should not damage the human health. So we have the Prime Minister's National Mission on Natural Farming, which safeguard the Indian agriculture against these risks. So we need to basically appreciate the value created by sustainable agriculture, and regenerative farming is something which should be adopted as soon as possible. It is based on the principles of agroecology, which can help reduce the input costs of these fertilizers or pesticides, improve the soil health, promote the judicious use of groundwater, reduce the depletion of natural resources, and at the same time increase the farm productivity and profits. Now again, other research have found that the community-managed natural farming also improved the health of the farmers, farm workers, their families, consumers, and it helped to build the social capital in the rural India. Then, based on different evidence, India must design its agriculture to sustain its food, nutritional and ecological security by identifying and scaling up systems that utilize ecological intensification. So we need to go with that ecological way of farming, such as natural or regenerative farming. The proponents of the currently dominated agriculture practices, what they are actually focusing upon is relying on synthetic inputs in farming systems to promote sustainable intensification. Now, they are saying that we would continue to use these synthetic fertilizers, and they call it as sustainable intensification, but this is obviously not something which is good in the overall long term. While sustainable intensification involves increasing productivity per unit area by utilizing inputs more efficiently, ecological intensification is only promising way to mitigate the risks of Indian agriculture. It also includes increasing the efficiencies of agriculture inputs and partially replacing the non-renewable sources such as the synthetic pesticides and fertilizers with renewable resources such as ecosystem services and biological pest control, integrated pest management, enhancing soil health and improving the biodiversity. A redesign of agriculture is something which is very much needed, and it should focus upon radical transformation by adopting regenerative farming and not relying merely on the managing the existing intensive system. Understanding and practicing the agroecological principles, enhancing the social capital and relying on knowledge-intensive systems. Again, what we need to focus upon is the intensive and longitudinal field research of the 15 agroecological zones. So in India, we have got different climatic zones, right? There has to be a focus upon all these climatic zones so that we can come up with a policy and then implement it. Will be only to scientifically establish the true benefits of the regenerative farming, generate the necessary evidence, raising awareness at the local level and about the climate resilience and the health and the environment impact of the regenerative agriculture. So overall, the gist is that we should basically not go with the current practice, neither we should go with the sustainable intensification, rather we should go with ecological intensification. That is what is needed in the form of natural or regenerative farming. The ground level evidence placed in the public domain will help create the political will and policy framework and lead to a development of a scale-up model for the uptake of regenerative farming. It would also contribute to the country's vision of achieving net zero status by 2070. Now, here's an added information, that is what is regenerative farming. So there are 5 principles. The very first is that we need to have focus upon diversity, that we should not go with monoculture. We should basically go with polyculture, different crops. Then we should minimize the soil disturbance. What we can do is mulching. We can cover the ground with these mulches, right? no dig till, no inorganic pesticides or fertilizers, keep it organic. Then we should incorporate the livestock. There has to be proper integration of the livestock also. We can use the residue of these animals as crop manure, right? Keep the soil covered, important, so as to retain its moisture. So these are the principles of regenerative agriculture. Talking about the National Mission on the Natural Farming, we have this particular mission, which is under the overall, which falls under the overall jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. So the objective is to implement self-sustainable, self-generating natural farming systems for the freedom from purchase inputs, which aim to cut down the cost of cultivation, enhance farmers' income, and ensure resource conservation and safe and healthy soils, environment, and food. So the overall objective is the same: to promote the regenerative farming, to promote the natural farming. These are some of the missions of this particular mission. You can have a look. Again, the National Mission on Natural Farming include knowledge collection, dissemination, training, and continuous capacity building for the farmers. So this is what you need to know with respect to this particular article. So coming to the next article, this is with respect to what is quantum computing. So we have a particular article in the text and context page of the Hindu, which has simplified this domain of quantum computing. So the gist of the article is, see, we have got classical computing where the information is sourced as in bits, right? Where a bit can have a value as 0 or 1. But in quantum computing, we have the qubits, the quantum bits, which can have the value as 0 and 1, and also anything between them, right? So that gives them an added variability, and that is the reason that quantum computing is something which has in some cases shown to be sort of 1,000 and in fact lakhs time more efficient than the classical computing. So therefore this article talks about the kind of principles which are used in quantum computing. So we have got the principle of superposition. We will study about that. We also have the principle of entanglement, right? So basically in superposition, what we are trying to say is that the value can be anything between 0 and 1. In the entanglement, what we are trying to say is that you have a particular qubit. If it changes its form, the other qubit which is linked to it would also change its form no matter how far they are. So that is the entanglement is all about. So we'll have a look and see what have been the recent sort of disruptive technologies in this particular domain. So quantum computers are the talk of the town. Their potential to solve complex problems much faster than the classical computers is an intriguing proposition to transform several industries. It is based on quantum mechanics, which is a part of the physics. Now, in 1982, Richard Feynman basically promoted the idea of developing a computer that could simulate both quantum and classical physics. But researchers realized that classical computers would struggle with the complexity of the quantum systems. Therefore, we had this idea of quantum computer which was born. Now, the classical computers, they are based on the principles of classical physics. Their fundamental computing unit is the bit. Each bit represents one piece of information of having two possible values, that is 0 or 1. It's possible to represent all types of information as a combination of zeros and ones using the binary system. So you have the classical computer where the information is stored as in a classical bit, in bits, where it can have either the value as 0 or 1, right? So all the information is stored in this particular format. Quantum computers, on the other hand, use qubits, that is quantum bits, to perform the computations. Unlike the classical bits, the qubits can exist in the states 0, 1, or in a state that is partly 0 and partly 1. State refers to the possible values of the qubit. So it's not just the state of 1 or 0. It can be anything between them, including 0 and 1. That is what quantum computers are all about. Now, the ability of the qubits to be in the two states, it is known as the superposition. So as I just told you, we have two primary principles which are followed in quantum computing. We have superposition and we've got entanglement, right? So to be in any state between 0 and 1, including 0 and 1, that is what the superposition is all about. It's one of the two fundamental principles of quantum computers. Imagine a spinning coin. So while it's spinning, it can be both a heads or a tail. That is what we talk about when we talk about the superposition. A qubit is like a spinning coin that holds both values simultaneously. While the classical bit holds one unit of information, a qubit can hold two. The quantum computers can perform multiple computations simultaneously. The second fundamental principle is called entanglement, right? So this is superposition and this is entanglement. What it says is that this phenomena allows qubits to be intrinsically linked to matter how far apart they are. That is, measuring the state of one of the qubits would immediately yield the information about the state of the other qubit. The instantaneous correlation between the qubits speed up the computations that would take far longer with classical computers. superposition and entanglement are exclusive to quantum mechanics and central to the potential that quantum computers have to offer. So these principles, possibly a question can come in the prelims also. Do remember what is superposition and entanglement. This forms the basis of quantum computing. Next, quantum computers are technologically superior, but this does not mean that they're superior to classical computers in almost all the domains. In some of the domains, definitely they are much, much superior to classical computers. Over the years, experts have developed specific tasks where quantum computers are capable of greater feats, right? So in 1994, we had Peter Shor, who created the Shor's algorithm, which would basically find the factors of large numbers in the moments rather than millions of years, which was required by the classical computers. Now, this has major implications for data security. So what it is trying to say is that through this particular algorithm, the quantum computers was able to solve a particular mathematical problem in a much faster way than the classical computers. Now, what you need to understand is that when we talk about the security architecture in the classical computing, it normally uses a particular algorithm based on a mathematical problem, right? So if you have these quantum computers who can break and solve that particular mathematical equation, that is something, a security threat, which can be posed by these quantum computers for the classical computers. Current methods to secure data involve locking the data and hiding the key in the solution to a difficult mathematical problem. But using Shor's algorithm, a quantum computer can quickly get the key and open the locks. In 2019, for example, the IBM unveiled the world's first circuit-based commercial quantum computer, Q System 1, and believed to be the most versatile for general quantum computing applications. In the same year, we had the researchers at Google who reported in the paper Nature in that particular 53-qubit Sycamore processor had achieved quantum supremacy. Now, what is quantum supremacy? It implies that when it can solve a problem that would take classical computers an unreasonable amount of time. The paper claimed that Sycamore completed a task in 200 seconds. That would have taken a supercomputer almost 10,000 years. Just imagine the kind of comparisons. Just compare the kind of speed we have in the quantum computers versus the classical computing. Now, earlier this month, Google unveiled a quantum chip known as Willow, right? Now, this is the world's first quantum processor in which error-corrected qubits improves. The quantum states are easily prone to errors. Now, this is something which you should remember. See, they are very much fragile. They're very much vulnerable. So, the environment can affect the state of the qubit. Therefore, they are very prone to giving errors in the computation due to interaction with the environment. So, quantum computers need error correction to hold the information long enough. Willow, the Google said, can finish a standard test in 5 minutes. Whereas the same calculation could take today's best supercomputers 10 trillion years. Just imagine, it's far, far ahead than the classical computers. Yet there are many significant challenges to overcome before quantum computers can become the commonplace. The first concern is building the quantum computers remains expensive and complex. Keeping many qubits stable is also difficult because of the error rates and decoherence. What is decoherence? It means when a qubit loses the superposition because of noise from its surrounding. That is when it is prone to error, when it loses its state because of the environment surrounding it. The problems for which we really need the quantum computers, like discovering new drugs or cracking mysteries in the astronomy, also require millions of qubits. All said, their potential to be useful is clear. That is why India has launched the National Quantum Mission in 2023, which sets aside almost 6,000 crore to be spent in over 8 years. Again, what we're trying to say is that this particular domain of computing is really very important. It has a lot of sort of potential, and therefore the government has also come up with the National Quantum Mission. This is what you need to know with respect to this particular article. So coming to the last article of the day, this is with respect to the conduct of election rules. That is the amendment which are made to the conduct of election rules. So the gist of the article is that we had the recommendations by the Election Commission, which said that particular amendments need to be made in the conduct of election rules so as to restrict the information to the public. Now, this has sparked a lot of debate, and again, the Congress party has obviously submitted a petition in the Supreme Court against this particular amendment which has been carried out. Let's look at this particular thing which has been done. The Centre on December 20 amended the conduct of election rules to restrict the access for the public to a section of poll documents. This was done by the Union Law Ministry following the recommendation made by the Election Commission. Now let's have a discussion with respect to what this conduct of election rules is all about. See, we have the Representation of People's Act of 1951. Through that, we have this particular conduct of election rules, which talks about the procedure in which the election has to be carried out, right? How the election has to be carried out. It gives a lot of powers to the Election Commission so that we can make sure that there is fair and transparent electoral system in the country. That is what the conduct of election rules talk about. Well, the Election Commission says that the amendment aims to restrict access to electronic data. The opposition has said up that it is basically saying that it is an attack on the right to information and electoral freedom. Now, what is this conduct of election rules? The conduct of election rules 1961 is a set of rules which provide for the provisions on how to conduct the elections as per the RPA, Representation of People's Act. What is this particular amendment? See, this particular notification, which is issued by the Ministry of Law and Justice, has made changes to the section 93 subclause 2 subclause A of the 1961 conduct of election rules. Now this earlier it stated before the amendment that all the other papers relating to the election shall be open to the public inspection before the amendment. After the amendment, what it reads it that all other papers are as specified in these rules relating to the election shall be open to public inspection. That is, they have basically inserted this thing as specified in these rules, right? So this is a kind of a restriction which they have imposed. Why this amendment has been brought now? So the move comes after a recent direction to the Election Commission by the Punjab and Haryana High Court to share all the documents related to the Haryana Assembly election, including the CCTV footage as also permissible under Rule 93 subclause 2 of the conduct of election rules. Now, according to the senior official of EC, what they have said is that the rule mentioned election papers. It has not talked about the CCTV footage, right? The election papers and documents does not specifically refer to the electronic records. So, in order to remove this ambiguity, this confusion, we have done the amendment, considering the serious issue of the violation of secrecy of vote and the potential misuse of CCTV footage. And it can also be, we can also have the usage of artificial intelligence to spread misinformation or disinformation, right? The rule has been amended. The Election Commission argues that sharing of the CCTV footage may have serious repercussions, especially in sensitive areas where secrecy is important or election papers and documents are otherwise available for public inspection. Why are transparency activists protesting? So we have Rule 93, which these activists say it is equivalent to Right to Information Act, right? So any change, it hurts the citizens' right to know. Also, we have some other people who are saying that upon the initial examination, the amendment appears to be aimed at restricting the citizens' voters' right to access a large number of documents created during parliamentary proceedings, right? So he has said that given the controversy about the voter turnout in the recent Lok Sabha elections and assembly polls, access to the presiding officer's diaries, which contain the detailed data about the voter turnout, are not mentioned specifically in the conduct of election rules. So this is a kind of what these transparency activists say, that this is a kind of restriction which is imposed on the free and fair dispersal of information. The amendment seeks to prevent access to such documents and many other reports and returns that are filed by various election officials. What the opposition is saying is, the opposition has said the change in the rules regarding the conduct of elections, it vindicated their assertions regarding the rapidly eroding integrity of the electoral process, which is managed by the Election Commission. The Congress has moved to the Supreme Court against the amendments on Tuesday. So this is for today. I hope you really enjoyed the session. Last but not the least, wishing you a very Merry Christmas. May Santa bring a lot of happiness and prosperity in your life. That is it. Thank you. All the best.